The JSE Index reversed course in closing slightly down on Tuesday, its lowest in nearly a year. This as investors looked ahead to the United States Federal Reserve's monetary policy meeting and the local medium-term budget policy statement here in South Africa today. Well, independent analyst Jimmy Moyaha joining us for a quick wrap of the markets and how they're shaping up at the JSE. Jimmy, good morning to you. Let's quickly launch into this conversation. Your overview of how the markets are faring this morning ahead of the midterm budget policy statement.
Morning, Chloe. Morning to the viewers. The markets are sort of jittery in early trade. We're seeing that they're trading in the red slightly, whereas Asian markets were in the green overnight, and the U.S. markets as well, largely finishing in the green. We know that we're still in the middle of U.S. earnings season as well, and so some of those movements would have been tracking through onto markets like the Nasdaq, which was up about 0.5% yesterday, with the S&P up about 0.2%. As I said, Asian markets were in the green. Tokyo leading the charge there, up almost 2.5%. South African markets started the day in the red. We're down about 0.25%, with resources mainly down about 0.75% there, and financials sitting flat. We're seeing a bit of weakness on the rand as well. The rand strengthened yesterday quite significantly, back down to about 18 rand 70, sitting at about 18.72 at the moment against the dollar. As you rightly mentioned, totally, there's a lot of data points that are coming out, particularly from the US and South Africa, with MTBPS coming out from our side today. The US has also got jobs numbers out later this week in the form of non-farms on Friday, and ADP numbers, if I'm not mistaken, that would be today. So a couple of data points that the market is keen to see, because they will point to whether or not the Fed would be considering another rate hike, considering holding rates steady. We still know that we are all but pricing in another rate hike from South Africa's perspective, unless something significant changes, and that rand strength that we're seeing now is a positive for us to be able to hopefully hold off that rate hike. But we know that we've gotten sticky inflation come out from South Africa's perspective, and that's going to give the SARB a bit of a concern. So interesting to see how that's going to develop. We know that the NPC meeting is taking place this month, so the end of this month, I think the 22nd or so of November, we'll get our rates decision there. So still lots that can happen between now and then. But a quick summary on the commodities side: oil holding steady at $87 a barrel, coming below that $90 a barrel level. And the gold price sitting at $1,978 an ounce, after having briefly touched $2,000 an ounce over the last couple of days, almost every single day.
Let's then talk about the midterm budget speech by the finance minister later this afternoon. Jimmy, there's a myriad of issues that the minister has to try and balance. That includes slow economic growth, high government debt, inadequate tax collection, energy and transport insecurity, rising inflation. There's so many of the issues that he has to try and balance. Your thoughts on whether he is going to be able to do this?
If we're being perfectly honest, it's unlikely that the minister is going to give a midterm budget policy update that will be appeasing to all stakeholders that are involved. I mean, you're in conversation with the Eskom chairman, and Eskom reported their results yesterday. Those results for the market, losses have doubled. The company is under pressure, and the minister has to take that into account, regardless of whether we want him to or not. The energy situation in South Africa is fundamental towards what is happening in the country, and is the reason that some of the economic growth, or the lack of economic growth, exists in South Africa. So the reality that the minister faces is that the situations at state-owned entities are in large part untenable, and he needs to then find a balance from that perspective. There's been rumors about tapping into some reserve funds that we really shouldn't be tapping into, and the reality that the minister faces now is whatever midterm budget policy statement he delivers, we are running short on revenue collection, expenditure continues to increase, and the situation continues to spiral. So unless difficult decisions are made by the minister, it's unlikely that every stakeholder that's involved, or every stakeholder listening to today's speech, would be happy with the result. There have been calls from business, from the private sector, even from the government itself, that some decisions need to be made, or some tough decisions need to be made. Now, whether or not that will happen, particularly as we head towards an election year next year, is something that remains to be seen. I don't want to say that you and I can remain hopeful that some of the right decisions will be made at this time. I think the speech that we're going to get today is going to be one of having to walk that tightrope that we've had to walk for the longest time, while having to balance appeasing the political side of it appeasing the political side of it to the detriment of the economy and to the detriment of you and I as South Africans. So unfortunately, this is not one of the midterm budget policy statements I'm looking forward to. I'll certainly be listening to the speech and analyzing the speech after it's done, but I'm not hopeful that we will get the news that we desperately need at this stage.
Let's talk company news. MTN Ghana, the results for the quarter of 30 September 2023, that's when that quota would have ended. Talk us through their numbers and add to it whether or not they're having a better time in Ghana than they are in Nigeria.
Yeah, that Nigerian picture is something else. Following that tax announcement, or the announcement that they're still waging that tax bill, the share price has really come under pressure. I mean, if you look at the share price's performance over the last 3 months, we've shed almost 40% on that share, of which 20% came last month alone. So we're below 100 Rand a share. I think we're at about 90 Rand a share on the MTN share price. If we look at the the Ghana data, that data is quite positive. The numbers are doing really well. There's growth in revenue, growth in subscribers. The mobile money business continues to excel. The problem with the Ghanaian picture is that Ghana deals with hyperinflation. So accounting for hyperinflation economies is a serious disadvantage to a company. I mean, if we look at just the growth numbers, we saw growth of about 30 to 35% across their service revenue in Ghana, but inflation over the last little period, I think over the last month, has been at about 38%. It's come down from a previous month of 45%. So you're dealing with excessive levels of inflation that are hampering real growth or real turnover results on that Ghana picture. But the business itself continues to fight on. They continue to they doubled their capital expenditure over this 9 months as compared to 2022. They've really done a lot to try and improve the service revenue, improve the data revenue, and as I said, the mobile money revenue is still growing by more than 50% there as well. So the business itself is doing well where it can, but it is contending with a difficult economic environment. I mean, the Ghanaian currency has lost about 29.7% year to date this year alone. So even if you look at that combined with the elevated inflation levels, it means that those returns that MTN Ghana hopes to realize at a group level are then watered down a lot by factors beyond their control. So the business has said they're going to continue from an outlook point of view to grow and invest where they can and strategically allocate capital and sort of maintain reserves as much as possible so that they're not overexpending themselves or just getting themselves into a lot of unnecessary expenditure. But the business is trying to pull through those revenues, and I think if they can deal with, if the inflation picture starts to turn around from that perspective, that'll do a lot towards how that revenue translates into group growth.
Let's conclude the conversation with the WBHO, who have sent an SOS over the so-called construction mafia, but add to that the issue of skills shortage. What's going on there?
Yeah, so we know the construction sector has come under a lot of pressure of late, and WBHO, as one of the leading construction companies, has said there's a couple of problems. I mean, obviously the inflation problems that we're seeing persist are something that factors into the input side of their businesses, but the government's lack of infrastructure development and infrastructure spend as well has been a factor that they've cited as well. I mean, we know that we got a couple of announcements, but the only real major institution from a government perspective that was embarking on a lot of infrastructure expenditure over the last year has been SANRAL. So that's put a lot of pressure on the sector, and WBHO has said that the construction sector has basically shrunk by about 40% over the last 6 years, which is quite significant if you think about the fact that the sector was already under pressure leading up to COVID. So it hasn't really gotten any better for the construction sector, and a lot of the concerns around the construction mafias and that are centered around developments. I mean, we've seen that in the past where a company like WBHO will embark on a development, but will start a project, and then there's members that pose either as members of community or concerned stakeholders that say we cannot allow the project to continue unless there is one, a buyout, or one or two, paying off of us as community members, or three, giving us a stake in the project, and those sorts of things. And that sort of mafia approach is what the WBHO is concerned about, saying that these organizations and these groups are not afraid to use violence and vandalism to halt projects or to jeopardize and sabotage projects unless they get what they want. And so they've asked the government to intervene in that respect. They've asked the government to help them get the construction space back on track. We know that government expenditure on infrastructure is such a huge component in the construction space beyond just the private sector expenditure on infrastructure and development. So interesting call from them at this stage. I mean, we know that from a midterm budget policy statement, this is something that the government has had to address as well in terms of allocations towards infrastructure spending that we usually get at our main budget in February. So I'd be surprised to see if we get any announcements around infrastructure expenditure in today's statement. I think more of an update around everything else will come through, whether or not those SANRAL projects have been able to get off the ground and that sort of thing. So I think WBHO also just using this as an opportunity to highlight that the construction space remains under pressure.
Jimmy Moyaha, thank you very much for that markets update. Independent markets analyst, giving us a sense of how things are shaping up at the JSE.